Hi everyone, let's get started. So my name is Avanas, and
I'm Wen.
we're graduate students from Nico Kriegeskordis Lab, and we're very excited to have Dr. Sam Gershman speak to us today.
Dr. Gershman was an undergrad here at Columbia, majoring in neuroscience and behavior. He received his PhD at Princeton with Ken Norman and Yale Neef in 2013. Then he became a postdoctoral fellow at MIT, where he worked with Josh Tenenbaum and Nancy Kemisher for 2 years. And in 2015, he joined Harvard as an assistant professor, where he received tenure last year. Dr. Gershman has published many papers with creative ideas ranging from resource rational decision making, predictive map theory of place cells, and how brains learn the latent structure of their environments. And the list can go on forever. It is very difficult to summarize all of the topics that Dr. Gershman has contributed to since the start of his research career.
Dr. Gershman just also just released a book titled "What Makes Us Smart: The Computational Logic of Human Cognition," where he reinterprets many seemingly irrational human behaviors using Bayesian tools. And he makes a compelling case that we may be doing the rational thing after all. And on top of all of these achievements, Dr. Gershman seems to always respond to emails immediately, which we think elevates him into the superhuman category. And yeah, today we're really excited to have him talk about the riddle of dopamine, and please join us in welcoming him.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. Okay. Good. All right, let me just hide this. So it's really special to be here. Well, not physically here. This building didn't exist when I was an undergrad, but here at Columbia was where I fell in love with neuroscience, and so it's a special pleasure to be back here to talk to you about what I've been doing. All right, so I'm going to talk about the riddle of dopamine. And speaker. Pardon? Oh, you can't hear me? All right, good. I will speak up. So everyone's probably seen this picture a million times, and I won't dwell on it. But I just want to say that this was sort of the picture that launched 1,000 ships. It was from a paper by Wolfram Schultz and colleagues, and it introduced this hypothesis that dopamine may signal a reward prediction error, the discrepancy between observed and expected reward. And I would say, to my mind, that this is one of the great success stories of computational neuroscience. And it's stood up to a lot of empirical tests. But today, I don't actually really want to talk about the successes of that hypothesis, but rather some of its failures and alleged failures. And in particular, almost immediately after the hypothesis came out, there were a bunch of challenges, some of which remain today. So for example, dopamine responds to novelty. Dopamine responds to aversive stimuli in some conditions. It responses to information that seemingly should be invisible to a pure model-free system, like changes in stimulus contingencies. And it shows ramping activity, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. And in response to a lot of these apparent violations, there was an effort to bridge the gap between theory and data and try to kind of patch up the theory in various ways to explain why the theory was actually compatible with these findings after all. So for example, you could introduce novelty bonuses to explain responses to novelty, or you could say that the dopamine system wasn't a pure model-free learning system after all, but it had inputs from some kind of model-based computation. And I'm not going to talk about this today. There are also some more fundamental challenges. A number of these have come from the work of Jeff Schoenbaum at NIH, and I'm going to talk about those at length in the second part of my talk. Just to summarize the basic findings now. So first of all, there are findings suggesting that dopamine transients are necessary for learning induced by unexpected changes in the sensory features of expected rewards. Similarly, dopamine neurons respond to unexpected changes in sensory features of expected rewards. And then these transients are both sufficient and necessary for learning stimulus-stimulus associations. And I'm going to suggest that these are, in a more fundamental way, problematic for the original reward prediction error hypothesis and require a more fundamental change if we want to rescue it in some manner. Okay, so here's the roadmap of my talk. I'm going to spend the first part of the talk talking about ramping and its challenges to reward prediction error theory. And then the second is about sensory prediction errors. Okay, so this all started with this study from Anne Graybill's lab by Mark Howe and colleagues. This paper in 2013, which showed a slow ramping activity as an animal approached a goal. This is a rat on a T-maze. And in that same issue of Nature, there was a commentary by Yael Niv that pointed out that this seems to contradict the reward prediction error hypothesis, because it's easy to imagine why a value signal might ramp up as the animal approaches a goal, but why would a prediction error ramp up, right? That's less obvious. And not long after that, people like Josh Burke suggested that actually dopamine isn't reporting a prediction error at all, but rather a value signal of some sort, reward expectation, and that the prediction error was the derivative of this value signal, which is a little bit computationally backwards in my view, because the whole point of computing prediction errors is to learn the value signal in the first place, right? So what are we supposed to do with this information? So the first order question is, are ramps really inconsistent with prediction errors? And at the time that this paper came out, I was a postdoc at MIT, and I immediately thought of an alternative hypothesis here, which is that actually you can get ramps as a consequence of reward prediction errors. And the basic idea is the following. So if the value function is sufficiently convex, so its derivative increases quickly enough as a function of proximity to the goal, then prediction errors will actually exhibit a ramp. And this has to do with the fact, which I'm going to show you in more detail in a moment, that when there's no reward being delivered, the reward prediction error is approximately the derivative of value, right? And so we can define conditions under which the derivative is going to be positive, and that's going to produce a ramp. And the precise shape of that ramp is going to depend on the shape of the value function. Okay, so this is just a proof of concept that it is possible, right? It doesn't necessarily say that this is actually what's happening, right? And then I'm going to show you in a moment some experimental work that I did in collaboration with Naochita's lab, which tries to provide more direct evidence for this account. Before I show you the data, I want to just walk you through the theory, because the reward prediction error hypothesis that I showed you at the beginning is really a cartoon, and I want you to understand more clearly what the actual theory is. Okay, so what is the goal of reinforcement learning theory? Typically, the goal of reinforcement learning is to estimate the value, which has the definition of the expected discounted return. So the return is the sum of rewards up until possibly infinite future. And you have this discount factor here, which exponentially downweights rewards that happen far in the future. And then this expectation here is just averaging over randomness in reward delivery, possibly actions, state transitions, and so on, right? And that defines the value at time t, okay? Now, on the face of it, this is an insurmountable computational problem. How are we supposed to estimate this quantity that requires us to average an infinite sequence? And in order to deal with this, we typically make some additional assumptions about the structure of the problem, which we can leverage for a more efficient solution. And the standard assumption is to assume some kind of Markovian structure where, conditional on some piece of information, which we call the state, we don't need to keep track of everything that happened to us in the past. We can predict the future purely knowing what the current state is. So in the absence of actions, we're just going to refer to this as a Markov process. Often you'll hear about Markov decision processes where there are actions that also affect state transitions. But just for simplicity, and since a lot of what I'm going to talk about comes from Pavlovian paradigms, I'm just going to talk about paradigms where there's no action. So there's just this state sequence, and the Markov process says that conditional on my current state, I can predict the next state probabilistically without having to remember what happened in the past. And it turns out that when you do that, you can rewrite the value function in the following way, in this recursive form that's called the Bellman equation, which says that the value is the immediate reward that you expect to get, plus the discounted future rewards. And using this Bellman equation is how we can derive efficient reinforcement learning algorithms. So the temporal difference learning algorithm starts from the idea that if you take the difference between the two sides of the Bellman equation, they should equal 0. And this defines a kind of consistency condition, which is that if you properly estimated these values, then this difference should be 0, right? So in practice, we don't have these expected values, but we have estimates of them. That's what these hats are, right? And then now we've gotten to the temporal difference prediction error, and that's the quantity that we think is being reported by phasic dopamine. Okay. So again, if you properly estimated these values, then this prediction error here, delta t, is going to be 0 on average, right? And that's the condition that says that you appropriately learned the values. And furthermore, it gives you information that allows you to update those values, right? So it says that your updated values should be proportional to the prediction error. This is just in the simplest case where you have some kind of tabular representation of values, right? And it gets a little bit more complicated if you have function approximation, but for simplicity, I'm not going to get into that. Okay, so intuitively, if I have positive prediction errors, I need to increase my value because my value estimate because it's been an underestimate. And if I have negative prediction errors, it tells me I need to decrease it. All right, so the thing that I want to call your attention to is the fact that when the rewards are 0, like think about in the Markow experiment, in the T maze, the rat is not getting any rewards, but it's approaching a reward, right? So our T is 0 during that period of time. And typically gamma is pretty large, pretty close to 1. So let's just ignore that for a second. Then we have this, this difference between the value at subsequent time steps. So essentially, if those time steps are small enough, we're talking about the derivative of value, okay? So reward prediction errors are, in this case, just temporal derivatives of value approximately. And now I'm going to talk to you about the experiments that were led by Hyung-Gu Kim in Naochita's lab, which tried to test this particular hypothesis more rigorously and distinguish it from the value hypothesis. And the way that he did this was creating a VR environment. So the animal's position is under complete control of the experimenter. And in particular, the experimenter has the ability to teleport the animal. And we're going to use this teleportation capability to distinguish between different theoretical predictions. Hyung-Gu did many experiments in this paper, and I'm not going to be able to tell you about all of them. I will tell you about the fiber photometry experiments he did, where we're measuring calcium activity from dopamine neurons that are projecting to ventral striatum. All right, so I'll give you an example of one of the experiments he did, where he teleported the animal either a short distance or a long distance, or just pause the animal for a minute, okay? Now, what I'm showing you here in the black line, in this black line, is the hypothetical value function. And you can see that if dopamine is reporting value, then because all of these teleportation conditions land in the same position on the value function, they should all converge to the same dopamine level, hypothetically, right? So that's what's shown here in this first plot. The reward prediction error hypothesis is different. It says that there should be transient bumps, and the size of those transits should depend on how big of a teleport it was, right? So in particular, the long teleport should show the biggest bump because it induces the biggest change in value. Remember, we're talking about the derivative of value, okay? And indeed, that's what we found experimentally, that the biggest changes were in the longest teleport condition. And you can see that it has the shape of this bump as predicted by the model. Another thing he did was do teleports at different positions on the value function. So in other words, in different points along the trajectory, and that's shown here. And you can see that because the value function is convex, you're going to get bigger changes in reward, bigger changes in prediction error for later teleports compared to early teleports. Whereas if you're coding value, then essentially you're just shifting this whole curve back a little bit, right? And so they should land on the same function if it were to have been shifted backwards, right? So these, you can see that these have really qualitatively distinct shapes. And indeed, we find that the dopamine transients look more like bumps, and the size of those bumps are bigger for the later teleports. Here's another example. I'm not going to go through all the experiments in this paper, but instead of manipulating the length of the teleportation or the position of it, he manipulated the speed. And the idea here is that when you manipulate the speed under a value account, the signal should always go to the same level, right? But it should go there faster or slower depending on the speed. Whereas in the reward prediction error account, the speed will affect the speed with the slope of this function, but it's not going to go to the same level. In particular, when you have fast teleportation, that's going to induce a larger prediction error, and so it will reach a higher level compared to a slow teleportation, and that's indeed what Young-Gu found. So speed increases both the slope and the peak of the signal consistent with the reward prediction error. All right. So to summarize where we are so far, in the controlled experimental setup we have using VR, we can show that the data from VTA dopamine seems to be much more consistent with a reward prediction error hypothesis than with a value hypothesis. But there's still a bunch of lingering questions. So one is that, as you may know, in classical conditioning tasks, you don't typically see a ramp. Okay, so this is an example from the Schultz study. So why is no ramping observed in classical conditioning tasks? So I want to start from the observation that there's always going to be temporal uncertainty in the sense that an animal, and this is true for humans also, will not know exactly how much time has elapsed in these tasks. Classical temporal difference learning models actually assume access to a perfect timer, but timekeeping in the brain is noisy, so you can expect that there's some temporal uncertainty. In some of the previous work that we've done, we've shown that dopamine dynamics do seem to be consistent with a temporal belief state, a probability distribution over elapsed time. And what that probability distribution does is essentially average the value function locally based on the temporal uncertainty. So it's kind of like blurring the value function. Now, importantly, when you get sensory feedback, that's going to partially resolve temporal uncertainty, because you can imagine the animal running down the hallway, either in VR or in the physical hallway, and it's getting some sensory feedback that tells it how much time has elapsed, because it can see actually how close it is to the goal, right? And that makes it fundamentally different from a classical conditioning task where, for example, you get a tone or an odor, and then nothing happens for a while until you get or don't get a reward. Okay, now the interesting thing, and this was kind of a surprise, was that the sensory feedback, by resolving temporal uncertainty, actually induces a bias in the learned value. And if you want asymptotically correct value functions, then you need to correct this bias, and correcting that bias will induce ramps. So let me show you, let me try to give you an intuition for how this works. So I'm showing the value as a function of time here. Now, imagine that the rat is right over here, or the mouse is right over here, and it has some temporal uncertainty. So that means that its actual value estimate is going to be sort of a blur of the values at earlier time points and at later time points. But notice that because this function is convex, right, it's nonlinear, so the change in the values above that time point is going to be bigger than the changes below it, right? So that means that the value is effectively going to be inflated relative to the case where there was perfect timekeeping, right? Now, that actually is not such a problem, because the values get inflated over here, but they also get inflated over here, and then these inflation factors can more or less cancel out. So you're not going to introduce a systematic bias. But when you have sensory feedback, what happens is that the inflation here gets reduced because of the fact that as you get sensory experience, you're resolving your temporal uncertainty, right? And so there's an asymmetry of the bias at different time points. And the upshot of this is that your learned value function will actually be higher than the true value function. So this is actually a surprising paradox that you can, by running these learning equations asymptotically, you can have 0 prediction errors on average, but you will actually have not estimated the correct value function. You'll have an optimistic estimate of the value function. And fortunately, there turns out to be a way to correct this bias. You can introduce a correction factor that will pull the values to their correct estimate. And in particular, the way this correction factor works is you have to decay the value estimate in proportion to the informativeness of the sensory feedback. So that explains why you don't have any of this decay theoretically when there's no sensory feedback, because there's no information. And you can see that with correction, you get the correct value, but the cost you pay is that you get non-zero reward prediction errors. So this explains actually why you would get ramps even after a lot of training in these tasks, right? where you'd expect reward prediction errors to go to 0 ultimately. Now, interestingly, this idea has been out there before. So Morita and Kato proposed heuristically a value decay model of reinforcement learning to explain some empirical phenomena. Here we're deriving it from normative learning principles. The other interesting thing about this is that it turns out that the bias correction leads to asymptotic reward prediction errors that are proportional to value. So in a way, we've come full circle to Josh Burke's idea, which is that reward prediction errors can actually sometimes look like values, surprisingly, at least asymptotically. But at the same time, we can explain why we see ramping in the tasks that are consistent with reward prediction errors, as I showed you earlier. Okay, and then as I said, in the absence of feedback, reward prediction errors will converge to 0, so no ramping. So we ran some simulations to just demonstrate that in Pavlovian conditioning tasks with no sensory feedback, you get this punctate response at the time of the conditioned stimulus, but no ramps, consistent with the data. But in tasks with sensory feedback like this T-maze, you do get ramps consistent with the data. Okay, so that seems like a good resolution of this paradox that actually does not require us to deviate from reward prediction error theory in any way, or at least in any substantive way, right? So we had to introduce these correction factors, but we're still, in essence, strongly in the domain of reward prediction error theory. I want to show you two more things about this. One is that we can pretty comprehensively simulate all the studies that were in in Hyung-Koo Kim's paper, and I'm not going to go through this, but just briefly, I want to show that to you. The other thing is that it led to a new prediction, which is that if the state uncertainty is rapidly increasing over the course of a trial, then we can actually get responses that look like a bump rather than a ramp, right? So that's now a qualitatively distinct phenomenon that hasn't been shown before. And the way we did this is by darkening the scene over the course of the trial. So we're back in VR. And I just want to show you that we get this bump. I'm not going to show you all the details of this plot, but I just want to call your attention to the fact that on this orange line, the theory says that you're going to get a bump rather than a ramp or just a flat function. And that's indeed what we see experimentally. And the intuition here is that early in the trial, blurring the value function is increasing its convexity, so you get a ramp. So that's the same explanation as we saw before. But then late in the trial, it turns out that blurring is actually going to produce concavity and therefore negative ramping. And that's what we see in the data as in the theory. All right, so to summarize where we are so far, I've shown you that ramps are compatible with the reward prediction error hypothesis. But to have a really complete theory, we need to introduce this bias correction, which explains not only why they happen, but also when they happen in their precise shape. And it provides a sound rationale for some prior ideas that attempted to explain these deviations in a somewhat ad hoc way. Okay, so maybe I should pause here in case there are any questions with this part of the talk. All right, I will keep going. Okay, so part one, just to put this in perspective, I would say that part one was a case where it seemed like there was something really wrong with the reward prediction error hypothesis, but we were sort of able to salvage it without changing it too much. In the second part of my talk, I'm going to talk about cases where it seems like we have to do something more substantial to change it in order to account for the data. Okay? So just as a motivation, I'll point here to a study from Ilana Witten's lab where they did 2-photon imaging of a large number of neurons in the midbrain, dopamine neurons, where they generated lots of different regressors like position, kinematics, reward history, and so on. And they basically built this big regression model and showed that dopamine neurons turn out to care about a lot of things, not just reward prediction errors. So there's already now evidence for some kind of diversity of dopamine, which is not explained by a theory which posits a scalar reward prediction error signal that's being coded presumably by all dopamine neurons together. All right, so how can we explain this kind of selectivity for things that aren't rewards on a standard account? So first, let me introduce a simple linear function approximation where we have a bunch of features. So these could be the inputs to some value function computing neurons. And then they're weighted by some weights W here. And that produces this weighted sum produces a value estimate. We can unpack the prediction error now as a function of this kind of sensory derivative, right? So it turns out that when you plug this into the prediction error equation, you get a sensory derivative component here. So this could explain why dopamine might respond to sensory transients. But what it's not going to do is explain the role of sensory predictions. And I'm going to show you some evidence for that. So I want to introduce a new theoretical framework for guiding your thinking about this. And it's based on this idea that goes back to some early work by Peter Dayan, where you can take a value function and decompose it as the product of two terms. So one is just the immediate reward in a state, and the other is this variable m, which is the expected future occupancy of that state, right? And that's what's defined down here. And we can define this also for features as well as for discrete states. So the intuition here is that if I want to know how valuable a state is, I need to know how immediately rewarding it is, and then also how often I'm going to visit that state, and then taking a linear combination of those things will give me my value. And so what you can see immediately here is that this looks a lot like the definition of value, except now for arbitrary features, not just for rewards. So it's sometimes referred to as a kind of cumulant, which can be applied to non-reward features. And what's particularly appealing about this idea is that you can write this down as a Bellman equation under this Markovian assumption, and you can write down a temporal difference learning rule analogously for this representation, the successor representation, a kind of predictive map of the environment. So my research on this was originally motivated by trying to explain some peculiar properties of place cells in the hippocampus that seem to be consistent with this kind of predictive map idea. And that, of course, left this question open of how those predictive maps are learned in the first place. And then a really appealing, but as yet untested idea was that temporal difference errors could drive updating, right? But the critical thing here is that you need a vector valued error signal. It doesn't work with scalar, right? Because now you have this whole vector of predictions and you need to update each one. So that seemed to provide a potential explanation for why you get a diversity of dopamine neurons coding different things. Maybe they're all doing, in some sense, a prediction error computation, but over different features. And that would also allow us to kind of rescue, in some sense, the original reward prediction error hypothesis, because that hypothesis is just a special case, right? If we have one of our features be reward, right, then we get reward prediction errors, but we can also get a bunch of other things. So the question is, can we employ this kind of theory to explain some of the diversity of dopamine that's observed experimentally? Okay, so this is the hypothesis, that the error signal is vector valued, and in particular encodes this successor representation temporal difference error, and it encompasses the classical RP when one of the features is reward. Right, and I told you about links to the predictive map, and there's a bunch of other links, which I'll skip over, but I can talk about later if you're interested. All right, so what I wanted to now is talk about some experiments that Jeff Schoenbaum's lab did, which seem to offer some pretty strong evidence for the idea that dopamine neurons are encoding a sensory prediction error of some sort. And then I'll show you also the simulations of this model that try to explain that coding. Okay, so this is an experiment that's sometimes called identity unblocking. So first, let me explain blocking. So if you have a queue, oops, where's my mouse? Here. You have a queue up here that's predicting some reward, and then you present it in compound with another queue, and the same amount of reward, then the intuition here is that for linear function approximation, at least, there's going to be no prediction errors generated here because the first train queue is already going to predict all the reward, and therefore there's no prediction error to drive learning of A for A, and therefore when you test A by itself, you're not going to show any conditioned response to A. Right? That's the blocking effect, the standard Kalman blocking effect. It turns out that you can unblock by changing the identity of the rewards. So that's what's shown here on the bottom, right? So here in the unblocking condition, you change the identity of one of these rewards, and then you see a conditioned response to this queue, to the blocked queue. And what the Schoenbaum lab did was they paired this identity unblocking manipulation with optogenetic inhibition of dopamine neurons. And they did this either at the time of the the reward presentation or during the intertrial interval. So if you inhibit during the intertrial interval, you don't see any effect, or rather, you don't see any effect of the optogenic inhibition. You see an identity unblocking effect, which is a larger response to the unblocked cue than the blocked cue. That's shown over here. But no difference between the conditions under inhibition. And that's something that we can capture with this model. The idea being here that identity unblocking is a form of sensory prediction error that can drive updating of this predictive map. But if you inhibit the prediction errors, then you don't get any updating of that map. And that's what produces this model prediction. Another paradigm that the Schoenbaum lab has used quite extensively is this task where there are blocks of trials where where the animal is getting some reward, and either the identity or the value changes. So in identity changes, the particular identity of the reward changes. And these rewards are matched roughly for the same value. Or in the value shift, the amount of reward changes, but the identity stays the same. And what they found was that when you measure firing rates of dopamine neurons, they show a transient increase in responding after a change in reward identity. It's also true of reward magnitude, reward value shift, but that would be expected under the standard hypothesis. But what's surprising is that you can get also changes for reward identity, right? Which shouldn't happen under the classical reward prediction error hypothesis if you assume that these rewards are roughly equal in value. And another interesting point here is that you only see this change transiently early during the block. It goes away late in the block. So the way that the model explains this is that you get sensory prediction errors early in the block after an identity shift, right? Because of, by definition, there's a sensory prediction error there, but it goes away. It basically moves to zero over time because those sensory prediction errors get reduced to zero. Here's another study. This is from Mel Sharp. This is a sensory preconditioning paradigm where there's stimulus to stimulus association phase or preconditioning phase. So stimulus A predicts X. There's no reward delivered here. And then the second stimulus gets paired with reward, and the probe test is on the first stimulus, right? So this stimulus has never been paired with reward, and yet animals will show a conditioned response. So that's a classical sensory preconditioning effect. What they showed was that optogenetically inhibiting dopamine during the sensory preconditioning phase removes or eliminates the sensory preconditioning effect, and that's what's shown here. This is alongside a control condition, and basically we can get a significant difference under the control condition, but not under the inhibition condition. And again, the model explains this because in order to do the stimulus-stimulus learning, you need a sensory prediction error to drive learning of stimulus-stimulus associations. All right. There are a few lingering questions. So one is, how are vector value prediction errors represented? And also, where are the predictions represented? So one idea is that there's maybe some kind of labeled line code that's defined at the regional level. So now Uchita's lab has shown that there are, for example, distinct parts of the midbrain that project to distinct parts of the striatum, and those seem to have different coding properties. And they've arrived at a different sort of theory about a diversity of dopamine. But basically, this is a kind of region-level diversification scheme. Another idea is a population coding scheme where each neuron partially responds to each sensory feature, so the error vector is actually distributed. And then we might expect that reward and punishment are privileged features, which is why they can be read out from individual neurons, right? In other words, you might want some form of robustness or redundancy built into the code where single neurons provide more information about reward features because they're especially important. So to provide some evidence for this, I collaborated with the Schoenbaum lab to take another look at some of their data from these tasks where there's identity and value shifts. That's what I showed you before. And they use, so first of all, they looked at the single unit responses. And what they found was that the firing rates are sensitive to changes in identity, but they can't tell you which identity. In other words, they will change when you change identity, but if you try to decode the actual identity, you can't get any information from single units. But you can get information from single units about reward amount, or rather when the reward is delivered, like whether it was delivered early versus late. So that's a kind of value correlate. So we have evidence that single units are not sufficient for encoding a sensory prediction error, at least in this study. Now, interestingly, if you take the population and you try to do decoding from it, you can, but only early in a block. Okay, so that's what's shown here. You can successfully decode flavor identity early in the block, but that ability goes down over time. And this might be consistent again with this idea that the error signal is being coded in a distributed way across cells, but as the error goes to zero, your ability to decode that information dissipates, right? And that would explain this pattern of results. All right, so I'm going to wrap up. So the first conclusion is that the reward prediction error hypothesis of dopamine is surprisingly resilient. So there are many apparent violations, but they seem to be only apparent. And I say that not as someone who's so deeply invested in defending this hypothesis to the death, where that's not really the hill that I want to die on. I just will make the observation that it seems to be surprisingly resilient for a computational theory. But there are some genuine problems with this hypothesis. And we can start to address some of these by rethinking and generalizing the core idea. So what I like about this successor representation and prediction error idea is that it retains kind of the core idea that dopamine neurons are computing discrepancies between observations and predictions, but it generalizes it in a significant way because now we're learning a vector valued representation, not just a single scalar reward. And it turns out that that's actually really computationally useful because it renders value computation a linear operation, which is good for a variety of reasons. And I want to finish by thanking my many collaborators in here, particularly stuff in the first part. I want to thank Hyung-Gu Kim, who did this absolutely heroic series of studies. And in Nao Uchita's lab, Nao has been really a beloved longtime collaborator, and my student John, who did a lot of the theoretical work. And then the second part of the talk, Matt Gardner, Jeff Schoenbaum, and Tom Stahlnatter. No, thank you for listening. We'll take questions.